Hello and welcome to this edition of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. We're really lucky to have Marc Kozlowski with us today, who's a forensic psychologist who specialises in the assessment of forensic risk for the family and criminal courts and parole boards. So he has extensive experience in the assessment of violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, child abuse and reoffending. So we're really lucky to have you here. He's held the position of head of psychology at various prisons in England and Scotland, and he's managed psychology teams. He's provided specialist intervention for groups of sexual and violent offenders with a broad spectrum of mental health and personality difficulties. And you're also a lecturer at the university. So we're really pleased to meet you tonight, Marc. So could you tell us first a bit about your route into forensic psychology?
It may be interesting to some of your listeners that there's more than one way to come in. So my first degree was in psychology at Leeds. I graduated in 1983. Yes, there was a 1983, and all my placements during the degree had been with clinical psychologists at local hospitals and so on. So I was assuming I was going to become a clinical psychologist. That was what my thoughts were. And then once I graduated, I realised actually I personally didn't feel comfortable going into that role yet. I knew that I was wanted to work in that area, but it was a personal thing. I thought as a 23-year-old, 24-year-old, whatever, did I feel ready to have a conversation with somebody who's 56, just been made redundant and got divorced? And I know the psychology works, and I know there are lots of psychologists in their 20s do a fantastic job. So it wasn't the psychology that I doubted, it was me that I doubted. So I thought I'd go away for a while, do something else, and I'll come back a bit later when I got some life experience under my belt. So I did go away. I had a completely different career, something completely unrelated entirely in the business world. And then just before I turned 40, I thought I better be now rather than never. Don't want to leave it too late. And so I got my master's. And just before I went to get my master's, I happened to be working by chance with some business psychologists at the time, purely by chance. And I mentioned that I was thinking of going back into psychology. And one of the people very kindly said, "Oh, let me do some psychometrics with you." So she did, and that was great. And anyway, I came back for the feedback, and she said, first thing she said was, "Whatever you do, don't be a clinical psychologist." So I was a bit taken aback because I thought that had always been the plan. And I said, "Oh, right, okay, why not?" And she said, "Because you're somebody who likes to see results of what you do. And if you're a clinical psychologist, you may be working with somebody over a long period of time and not see any shift, or it may be a very slow shift or very slight shift, and that won't make you feel that you're getting job satisfaction." So that was really massively helpful insight, and unexpected, and just came out of the blue at the right time. So I did my master's in forensic rather than anything else. Was lucky enough to get a trainee position, and then worked up the same as everyone else did. So it's interesting because at that point in my life, I had 4 children, and there was a 5th one shortly to arrive. So taking a 75% pay cut was quite exciting at that stage. So I'm very grateful to my wife who did this, that, and everything to make ends meet for us. But while I was a trainee, we got there in the end, thanks to her. And and then I worked up to being head of psychology in prison service, and then now I'm a lecturer and associate professor at Edinburgh Napier.
It's interesting you said that psychologist said to you, well, it's going to be slow, you might not see the progress. Because I was thinking, gosh, there's lots of people we work with where we have this conversation, there could be slow changes, or, let's not expect huge steps. We might expect to step back before we go too forward again. So it sort of rang true anyway. I mean, if that's been your experience, I'm not sure.
I feel like you don't always get results in forensic either, as we all know, and that can take a slow process as well. So I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in clinical. I wouldn't like to make comparisons. I've not done the two, I've only done the one. So
yeah. So you've got quite an interesting role. So tell us a bit about this role of risk assessment accredited assessor for the High Court.
The purpose of the Risk Management Authority is to accredit risk assessment tools and to accredit risk assessors, so that before you can write a risk assessment report for the High Court, you have to be accredited by the Risk Management Authority. And they also monitor the reports that are written. So it's quality assure, if you like. Quality assure in hindsight. They don't quality assure before you submit it. but they keep an eye on what's going on to make sure that everyone's working to the right level. And I think that's a real bonus, because it means that there's some clarity about what the standards are, and the courts will expect to see the same things in their reports, and and so on and so forth. So I think it brings a consistency and a clarity, I think, to the process when it's in that kind of highly charged high court situation. Particularly, in particular, it's designed cases where the person has been sentenced. The sentence doesn't attract a life sentence, but the judge is concerned that something either about the offence or the offending history means that person may go on to commit a more serious offence. In which case they can, if they want to, apply something called an order for lifelong restriction. Now, if that sounds a bit familiar, it's a bit like the IPP, but it's used much more cautiously than that and much more sparsely than that. And the decisions to use it, as I say, will involve having a full psychological risk assessment report, among other things, before the decision is made, the sentencing decision is made. So that's really where we get involved as RMA assessors, or RMA accredited assessors, I should say. And so it's fascinating, and it means that you get to have access to absolutely everything, which when you work in the prison service, there's so many documents and people you'd like to speak to, and they're just beyond reach, because you're not supposed to, at least certain people need to be careful who you speak to and which documents you see. So here, for example, the Procurator Fiscal, which is the equivalent of the Crown Prosecution Service, will open up. I'll show you the videos of the interviews with the police, with the witnesses, with the victims, and so on. You have full access to all the information that was held that was used in court, and it's a really rewarding, after years of writing psychological risk assessment reports, to have access to everything you've always wanted to have, and it means you can write that the depth and breadth that you want to get into your reports. So purely on a, excuse me, on a professional level, it's very satisfying to be able to write at that level of detail. It's a big piece of work. They're a massive piece of work, these reports. The last one took me 160 hours, but it's such a satisfying, because all those skills that you've honed over the years, you can actually apply them all in one report, and I feel like you've done a good job.
Who do you write for? Is this a request? Is there a pool of you and you get asked to write these or assess a particular case, or how does that work?
It's where the High Court judge thinks that the person's been found guilty already, so the trial has finished, it's concluded, and the person's been found guilty. And the judge is thinking, well, this offence doesn't attract a life sentence. However, I have concerns about this person. I think they may go on to commit more serious offences. So I want someone's opinion on that. So that's when they get involved. They go to the risk management authority and say which risk assessors are available at the moment. The RMA will point them to the next person that's available, and the court will contact us and say, appoint us basically as risk assessors. It's actually written into law that in Scotland there's a law governing how these sentences are administered, how the risk assessment report's written, and so on. So it's all very enshrined in the statute. Again, it adds to the clarity of the process, and it makes it easier to understand for the offender themselves and everyone else involved, and it creates a kind of consistency in the process.
And what does the training involve then to be an accredited assessor?
Okay, the training for the assessor is really the RMA runs a training course. It's quite a brief training course, because you can only apply for it if you're already quite experienced. So they're not training you from like a trainee level. They expect you to have several years' experience as a psychological risk assessor. And so you attend this training, they talk through what's involved in the role, so that you're aware of what you're committing yourself to, and they go through various details, give you a chance to ask you questions, and then you submit 2 of your own reports that you've written, obviously anonymised, and they ask you questions about those reports. A bit probably like I suppose a slightly gentler version of what might happen in a court. It's not quite as adversarial as it would happen in a court, but it's the same gist. It's the same kind of approach.
So it sounds similar, but not quite as intense then as sort of expert witness trainer.
Yes, which I've just recently done, funnily enough. So, and one of the conversations we had in that training, I did some training with Bon Salon, expert witness courtroom skills, and one of the conversations we had was, when you're an expert, at what point, who flicks the switch to say you're now an expert? Because you can work for years and years and years and never actually call yourself that. When I was a trainee, I was always told, and it's in my DNA now, that you're not an expert witness, you're a professional witness. I think for me, and I think what we agreed in the room in the training was, if you're being called in to discuss a case that you haven't been involved in previously, then you're being used as an expert witness, you're being regarded as an expert witness. Yes, so in other words, if you're a treating psychologist or somebody who's worked with the person, then probably it's safer to think of yourself as a professional witness. And if you've never seen the case before, and you're given a bit like the High Court appointing an RMA assessor, then the court considers you to be an expert witness. So that's how it was explained on the training anyway. So.
And this role in Scotland then only confined to forensic psychologists, or are there other people that would do it?
No, forensic psychiatrists. I'm trying to think of any other professions. I think in theory it could be anybody that's good at doing forensic risk assessment, psychological risk assessment. All the people that are coming to my head right now are either forensic psychologists or forensic psychiatrists. But I suppose you'd expect that because they're the people that would have the most experience.
But the way you described when you'd be called on doesn't sound like there'd be that many cases per year in Scotland who would fit that criteria. There
suddenly are now. It's increasing quite fast. So initially it was slow. There was a slow drip of cases that, or people who were given the order for lifelong restriction, or the OLR as it's known. But it's increasing quite fast. Nothing like the speed of IPP. I mean, we're nowhere near that level of intensity and numbers, but it is increasing. And the RMA recently put out a request saying, we know everyone's busy, but can anyone do another report? So there is quite a need for it, yes.
So how many reports do you think you do a year then?
I'd say if you've got another job, I'd probably go 2 or 3. It depends on what your other job is and how many hours it is. So some people might be doing, I suppose, a forensic psychologist might be doing session work, for example, in which case they may have more time for other things. And myself as an academic, there are points in the year when I couldn't even consider doing anything else because I can't even keep up with the university work, like periods of intense marking and so on. It's weekend working just on its own. But there's other points in the year when there are a few gaps and you can take some time off. And I usually take annual leave to go and do the actual work, and it fits better. And so you're able to do both quite comfortably there. So as long as you time it right and make yourself available at the right times of the year, I think it's achievable and very satisfying because, of course, it gives me a change instead of teaching and marking and so on, which I love doing. But like as with anything else, if you keep doing the same thing over and over, sometimes a change is good for you. And it gives me that change. B, as I say, it's an opportunity to do a risk assessment report kind of in depth, in the real depth and breadth. So it's very satisfying in that respect. And of course, it's a double win because then I'm keeping my own skills up to speed. And I can then go back to the students and say, I recently had this case where this thing happened, and this is how it was dealt with, and I can talk with first-hand experience of the process of being in a courtroom, for example, or writing a report for the court.
Yeah, I think it's always more interesting with real-life cases, isn't it?
Yes, I think it brings it to life, doesn't it? And each case, and I think one of the nice things about talking about real cases is that every time you do it, it illustrates that it's not a straightforward if this then that process. The flow chart for risk assessment is not a straight line by any means. There's all these sideways movements, aren't there? But this and then also that, and then the interaction of these. So by having a real case, you can actually make that point probably better than you could, as I say, by just talking at people. So I think everybody benefits actually.
Do you feel like you had to learn two very different court systems, being in England and Wales and Scotland, being quite different in many respects, really?
Yeah, I didn't work in courts in actually, no, I did a couple of family cases in England and Wales, but I didn't do any criminal cases in England and Wales, so I didn't get court experience there. However, the role of the psychologist is pretty much identical, and you know the assessments are the same assessments, and the purpose of you being there, bringing in the literature, bringing the knowledge about risk and so on, and applying the knowledge of risk to that particular case, which is what the court want you to do. That's the same process, but yes, there's different terminology, and the process is slightly different things. So you have to you hear some new phrases, and you have to think, well, what's that like? What does that equate to in my previous existence? So, for example, the parole board, where we do lots of, as you know, lots of forensic psychologists do a lot of appearances at parole board hearings to speak to and be questioned about our reports on people. In Scotland, it's less often. You're less often called for your report is regarded as primary evidence, I think is the phrase.
So you were recently involved in an event called Psychology in the Pub, and I thought that looked a really good idea. I don't know if you remember, a lot of years ago, we went to Birmingham for, what was that called? A Pint of Science.
Yes.
That's called. We did a similar thing, so I was glad to see it was still going. But I wondered if it was a similar thing, as we went just literally to a pub and gave a talk about something or other to do with.
That's exactly what I did, yes. And it wasn't actually my own students. It wasn't Edinburgh Napier students. It was Glasgow University students. And they have a psychology society. And every so often, the Psychology Society hires or books a room in the pub. And they say exactly that. They'll either give presentations to each other, or they'll invite a speaker to give a talk to them as well. And that's exactly what I did. I walked into this pub, went to the back room where they were all sitting, and gave them a talk about forensic psychology as a career. And apparently it went down very well. They found it very interesting to have an insight into what the actual job is and what it's not. Because as we know, there's lots of misconceptions about what forensic psychology is.
Yeah, and it's much more relaxed sort of atmosphere, isn't it? People can sit down and relax, have a drink, and just have a discussion about it, rather than feel like they have to go to a lecture about it.
Yes, exactly, and that applied to me as well. So once I finished my presentation, as you say, it was very relaxed, so that the students were chatting amongst themselves about what they just heard, but some of them came over and chatted with me as well. And so you had that kind of networking, social bit, and it felt much more conversational than it might do in a lecture room. You try to make lectures discursive. You try to, engage students in discussions as much as possible. I do anyway. I think it's much more engaging if you get the students to think for themselves and talk for themselves, rather than just listen to me droning on. And it had that kind of feel about it. It had that nice chatty, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Those kind of conversations, rather than the formal teaching styles. Yeah.
Obviously, balancing lots of roles, did you get a lot of diversity in those different roles? What sort of focus is your university role on?
Okay, so I left prison service in Scotland in 2018, so 5 years ago. In fact, it's 5 years ago last month. I've just passed my 5-year thing, and I wanted to develop a new master's program to prepare psychology students for applying to become trainees. And there are a couple of things driving that, a couple of reasons for that. Well, from a personal perspective, one of my favorite parts of the role of being a chartered forensic psych is the supervision, helping trainees to develop and nurturing them and seeing them trip over, get up and dust themselves off, and then help them through that process, as we all have done. And anyway, that's another whole conversation, isn't it? But, but I used to love that. And so teaching is almost like it's the same thing, but brought forward a stage, if you know what I mean. And it also gives me an opportunity to prepare the master's students before they even start getting to their application stage, for a trainee position, to become aware of some of the things they'll face. So I thought, wouldn't it be good to have a master's where that's kind of threaded into it, the terminology and some of the skills as on top of the theory as well. So for example, we teach forensic interviewing, and they get a chance to just practice that, and then they get assessed on a very small, manageable exercise of asking and trying to encourage somebody to give some information. Similarly, with motivational interviewing, they get a chance to have a go at that, and writing and doing a risk assessment or parts of a risk assessment, usually an SPJ tool, structured professional judgment tool, risk assessment tool, they get to do either a bit of a violence assessment or a bit of a intimate partner violence assessment, and then they get to write a risk formulation, which for me, I think that's what forensic psychology brings to the whole thing. For me, that is absolutely key, and that's really what we're there for, is to explain, to go away, do our scientific, jargon to other people, jargony type assessments and so on, but then to come back at having processed all that and to give a narrative explanation of why this person came to commit the offences they did at the time they did against the victims they did, in a way that's understandable to someone who's not a psychologist. For me, that's exactly what we're there for.
Feels like a useful process to be able to show people exactly what you do, really, rather than have this image of or imagination about it. Does this mean you tailor how you work with MSc students to how you might supervise a trainee?
Yes, I try to role model the supervision model with them, and we also have reflection as well, so they write reflective pieces about various parts of the course.
The different settings, secure units versus prisons, courtrooms, all the different places we sort of find ourselves working in. Is there more emphasis on forensic or different settings?
So the two practitioners that run the program, myself and my colleague, we are both forensic. However, in that guest lecture series that we have in the third term, I have in the past invited clinical forensics from NHS Scotland who work at the State Hospital, for example, which is a secure hospital in Scotland, forensic psychiatrists, and so on. So yes, we try to introduce other people there into the process, because Adam and I can't speak personally about the experience of being clinical, but also we've worked alongside clinicals frequently, so we're able to show the students that perspective through those guest lectures. Yeah, and in terms of environments, I think probably the way we deliver, I'd like to think that the skills will probably be the same skills in whichever environment you're working, or a lot of the skills will be the same. Like the motivational interviewing is motivational interviewing, you know what I mean?
Well, it's a really interesting subject. There was a really helpful guidance document on the BPS website that talks about competency-based psychologists, and in fact we should be calling ourselves practitioner psychologists regardless of discipline, because we work in really different settings. I've worked with educational counselling psychologists. We've all worked in the same unit doing the same job, whoever we've been,
with the same people.
We are registered psychologists, absolutely. So it's a really valuable point when we're thinking about different settings. It's nice to hear.
I think I absolutely get the point, and I think it's a really important point that you just made there. I think it may be more important to other people for us to put that other word in front of it. So, for example, the court, if the court's appointing somebody, they might want to hear either clinical or forensic in front of the word psychologist, so they don't end up with an ed psych or a business psychologist, I suppose. But I absolutely take your point. I think internally, we psychologists are applying very many of exactly the same skills, aren't we? Just to a slightly different end in some cases.
No, it's interesting, and also here, of course, we've got more forensic psychologists now working in community as well, with services where they're trying to the offender pathways, they call it. I never like calling it that, but that's what they call it, the OPD pathway. You try to put money into the community to try and keep people in the community and help them reintegrate them back out. What are your future aspirations then as a forensic psychologist?
To be honest with you, at the moment, that the focus at work at the university side of things is that we're looking at the possibility of introducing either top-up doctorate and then potentially beyond that a full doctorate as well in forensic psychology, because we have forensic psychology undergraduate level, now at master's level. So that would be the next logical step. Then we'd have kind of the full set. And so we're actively looking at that at the moment in terms of a kind of immediate to mid-term future. Beyond that, for me personally, as I say, I'm in my early 60s now, so I wouldn't, if I did retire, I don't think I could stop doing it. I genuinely don't. I'd miss it horribly, I think, and I would probably do the RME, the court work, or something similar to that, for example. for as long as I could, for as long as they allowed me to, because it's just, I mean, it's just such a rewarding thing to do. It's demanding, and it can be frustrating, but man, it's rewarding, isn't it? This job that we do.
Mm.
So yeah, I hopefully, as long as they'll allow me to, I'll keep doing it.
Have you got any areas of interest in terms of research that you're involved in, or that you would like to think about working in?
No, I don't. I'm unusual in that respect, I suppose, because at the Edinburgh Napier University, there are different professional pathways. There's an academic pathway, research pathway that each member of staff will be on. I'm on what's called the practitioner pathway. So my practice skills are the thing that I bring and the thing that I work on. So, for example, becoming RMA accredited was me demonstrating that the value that I'm bringing to the university, because I can now, for example, teach the students like the courtroom skills and the writing for a high court and so on, those kind of things. So that's seen to be my value because I'm on that particular pathway. My colleague Adam Mahoney, he is an active researcher. He looks at trauma-informed, compassionate, focused therapies and so on in a forensic setting. So he's doing a lot of work with that. And we have colleagues in the department who have done work on eyewitness testimony, facial recognition, wrongful convictions, all the juror decision making, kind of the broader criminal justice areas of interest, where psychology has obviously quite a lot to say, because it's around perception and memory and witness reliability and that kind of stuff. So the department, I think, has a nice portfolio of research, but I personally am more focused on the practice.
It's interesting, but I guess you're supervising the MSc project, which is more research.
Oh, a lot, yes. Yeah. So every year every year between us we supervise 22 master's students projects. So that's an empirical project each and a systematic literary review each. So we're our research skills, I suppose, in that respect, are kept very much up to speed, because we have to be able to give advice, to steer, and to then assess in a meaningful way. So yeah, so research skills are kept up, but I'm not a published researcher, is what I think was probably what I was meaning. Yeah.
Well, we've always tried to, when I got my master's, it was sort of the expectation was that you'd write your master's up for Forensic Update, and I always thought that's what everybody did, and then it sort of gradually fell away. So we're trying to encourage people to start doing that again, really, to get the skill of writing up and getting publishing, getting feedback and understanding, because every single journal you write for is different, and how you write for each journal style is different. So it's a good skill to have, just to have tried to
yeah, and what we do with our empirical project is we get the students to identify a journal to which this might be suitable for submission, and they write up their project to the publishers, the author's guidelines of that particular journal.
That's a good idea.
Just to get a hand in with that, yeah.
Because otherwise you learn the skill of writing for a university, but that's not the skill you need for writing for a journal.
No. I mean, I'm surrounded by people. Obviously, almost all of my colleagues are PhDs, so they've been through that painful. They all have very similar stories to tell about getting about getting the PhD, which they actually hate the sight of by the time they submit it, and they never want to see it again, kind of thing. But that seems to be a universal story. And then B, then they have to spend hours chopping out all this work they spent hours doing to make it suitable for such and such a journal, and they all have that in common as well. So it seems to be some very similar themes, very common themes around research and publication. Yeah, I always found Forensic Update really interesting, by the way, when I was a practitioner in the prison service, just to get a sense of what other people were doing and other people's experiences and things I may never have thought of trying out. I always found it really, that was one of the journals that I always made a point of reading, rather than just putting it on the pile to read with manana, which never comes, as we know.
It's good to hear, but it was easy to pick up and put down, wasn't it? I mean, I think that's the benefit of having it posted to you, as always. You could just read a bit of it and then pick it up a bit later.
Exactly.
Actually, They've just done something to digitalise it now, so that if you have a paper published in it, it's found on Google. If they've done something to it, so that happens.
Oh, great.
It makes it more attractive to people who are publicising, getting things published. If that happens, obviously that's
Yeah.
what we want people to
And
be able to read it.
more students will then come across it when they're doing their
Yeah,
list searches as
yeah,
well. So that's great,
yeah,
because that means it's bringing it into a whole new audience, doesn't it? So
yeah.
that's great.
So yeah, it's all
Excellent,
trying to
excellent. That's
keep
good
up
to
to
hear.
date.
Yeah, good.
Well, it's been really lovely to talk to you, Mark, and we appreciate you giving up your time and having a chat about all the different variety in your roles. So I think that all that leaves us to say is let's talk forensic psychology.